In 1948, the United Nations proposed the partition, which would have created two states and an international city of Jerusalem. The Israelis accepted, the Arabs rejected it. And the next day, 6 Arab nations invaded Israel, the first of many wars, which an increasingly strong Israel has won. Almost every Arab leader I know now would gladly accept the partition plan that was rejected in 1948. Because the reality is that the offers made since then are fewer and less attractive. And I said to President Abbas, and I said to Chairman Arafat many times, there is not a single shred of evidence that you can cite to me to suggest that the longer you wait, the offers are going to get better. They're not. The 1948 partition plan is not now on the table and never again will be. So in my judgment, what they've got to do is to sit down and negotiate and get a deal that creates a state and builds on it. And that will resolve the settlements issue. Then they'll know what's Israel and what's Palestine, and anybody can build what they want in their own country. But the longer this goes on, the less optimistic one must be, because the opportunities for both are going to decline. So for both sides, the answer is get in the room, sit down, and negotiate an agreement that will be less than 100% of what each wants, but much better than the alternative for both. Now, with respect to the Arab Spring, it has created great anxiety on both sides. Although they differ in many respects, the Palestinian Authority and the government of Israel both had as a pillar of their policy in the region their relationship with the government of Egypt, and specifically with the person of Mubarak. So both were very disappointed, angry when Mubarak left office. Sometimes people get a rather fantastic view of American power, and they felt that if we really had wanted to, we should have been able to keep Ben Ali in office and keep Mubarak in office and leave things the way they are. So the natural human reaction in a time of turbulence is to hunker down, to wait and see what happens, see how this settles before they make what they regard as existential decisions. And that's what has occurred. And one of the concerns I have is that most revolutions don't resolve themselves completely in a couple of weeks or a couple of months. There may be some Americans here who will recall that between the time of the victory at Yorktown and the establishment of government, 7 years elapsed.
I think for the first time in a long time, the Palestinians have got some good tactics, but the tactics are not the same as a good strategy. And let me explain why. I think it's a plausible case that if the Palestinians hadn't pursued their UN process, we wouldn't even be talking about two-state solution here. We've got our hands full with the Arab Spring, economic meltdown around the world, and I think the Palestinian judgment in the first quarter of this year was, we're going to get left out of this global conversation completely. In September 2010, President Obama said, look forward in a year's time to having a Palestinian state at the UN, and they looked at this and thought, we're just not even going to be part of the conversation. And so I think it was actually, it's been a smart tactic to go to the UN, to mobilize opinion, to raise their concerns, but they've been wrong-footed by the allegation that going to the UN is somehow an alternative to a negotiating track. One thing I've always banged on about is the regional dimension to it. The second is the international dimension. And I think the truth is that given where American politics is and how competitive it is, we're expecting a huge amount if America's going to bear the whole burden of driving these two parties to a solution. And my feeling is that it's worth remembering that Madrid was an international conference, that the first Bush administration did mobilize wider international engagement on the process. And given the overwhelming international consensus, it is striking how little that is brought to bear on the feelings of the two parties. And so I would be very supportive of trying to think hard about how do you internationalize the effort as well as regionalize the solution. And I don't think that's an anti-American thing to say. I think it's a recognition of the reality of America's role in the world and the other pressures on it. Now, that's especially the case given that history isn't going to stop for the next 14 months while America decides who its next president is going to be. The quartet is one nod towards internationalization, but of course it doesn't have an Arab partner of a serious kind. Given that part of this process is going to require more responsibility from Arab states in thinking about how they'll live up to the Arab Peace Initiative, I think they need to be part of a more structured dialogue. Also, if it's too difficult to have Obama parameters, then we need some international parameters that need to come out in a more, out of some kind of international process. And I think it's in that way. I don't think the EU launching its own parallel track would be sensible at all. But I think that if you're saying should there be a forceful EU role with Americans and the UN and others, then yes.